The silver ships appeared in Earth's outer solar system on a Tuesday morning, when most humans were still drinking their coffee and checking the news. Captain Jake Morrison was running systems checks on Luna Station when the alerts started flashing across every screen in the command center. His coffee cup fell to the floor as he stared at the impossible reading showing 12 massive vessels moving through space near Jupiter, with technology that defied every law of physics humans thought they knew. Ambassador Zeth Kara of the Vorthak stood on the bridge of the lead vessel and watched the small blue world through crystalline eyes that sparkled like diamonds in the starlight. The planet looked unremarkable from this distance. Just another water world spinning around a yellow star in one of the galaxy's outer arms. The crystal being's thoughts moved through geometric patterns as it reviewed the preliminary scans of the third planet. The readings showed a young species that had barely learned to leave their home world, with primitive rocket technology and basic nuclear capabilities that would have been impressive 10,000 years ago. The Galactic Council had been exploring and cataloging worlds for longer than this species had existed. Zeth Kara had personally overseen first contact with 47 different civilizations during its 3-century career. Most followed predictable patterns. The young ones were always excited and fearful in equal measure, desperate to prove themselves worthy of joining the greater galactic community. They offered whatever resources they had in exchange for even the most basic alien technology, grateful for any scraps of knowledge that might advance their primitive understanding. Dr. Lisa Parker was in her laboratory at the International Space Research Center when the emergency broadcast interrupted every television and radio signal on Earth. She dropped her specimen samples and ran to the communication room where hundreds of scientists were crowding around monitors showing fuzzy images of ships that looked like nothing humans had ever built. The vessels were enormous, each one larger than the largest cities on Earth, and they moved through space without any visible means of propulsion. The insectoid hive mind Zexthol clicked its mandibles in what passed for amusement among its species. As it reviewed the preliminary cultural analysis of the humans, the report showed a fractured civilization still divided into competing nation-states, constantly fighting over resources and territory like children squabbling over toys. Their military technology was laughably primitive, consisting mainly of explosive projectiles and crude energy weapons that could barely penetrate basic defensive barriers. Most concerning was their apparent inability to unite even in the face of an external threat, with various government factions already arguing about how to respond to the alien arrival. Jake Morrison found himself appointed as Earth's primary contact representative, not because he was the most qualified, but because he happened to be the highest-ranking military officer already in space when the aliens requested a meeting. He had exactly 4 hours to prepare for the most important diplomatic encounter in human history, while government officials on Earth shouted contradictory instructions through increasingly frantic radio transmissions. The energy-based Luminar floated through the council ship's conference chamber like a living aurora, its consciousness flickering between dimensions as it analyzed the primitive electromagnetic signatures emanating from the human space station. The beings, called humans, appeared to be carbon-based bipeds with remarkably short lifespans and limited sensory capabilities. Their technology relied on crude chemical propulsion and basic electronic circuits that would have been considered obsolete museum pieces on any civilized world. When the meeting finally took place in the sterile white conference room of Luna Station, Jake Morrison tried not to stare too obviously at the 3 alien representatives who had somehow materialized in his station without triggering any of the security sensors. Zeth Kara looked like a living crystal sculpture that changed colors when it spoke, while Zexthol resembled a giant mantis wearing elaborate ceremonial armor. The Luminar was hardest to look at directly, appearing as a constantly shifting cloud of colored light that hurt human eyes after more than a few seconds. The translation devices the aliens provided worked perfectly, converting their various forms of communication into clear English that Jake could understand without any apparent delay. Zeth Kara spoke for the group, explaining that the Galactic Council was a confederation of advanced species that maintained peace and order throughout this section of the galaxy. They had come to evaluate humanity's potential for inclusion in the galactic community and to offer limited membership benefits to species that met their basic criteria. The evaluation process took 3 days and involved tests that Jake barely understood, even with the aliens' patient explanations. They measured human reaction times, problem-solving abilities, technological advancement levels, and social development indices using methods that seemed almost magical. Teams of human scientists were allowed to observe some of the testing procedures, though most of what they saw left them more confused than enlightened. Dr. Lisa Parker was among the small group of humans permitted to examine alien technology samples during the evaluation period. The devices they were shown appeared deceptively simple, looking like smooth metal objects with no visible controls or power sources. Yet these unremarkable items could apparently manipulate gravity, generate unlimited energy, and process information faster than any computer humans had ever built. When she asked how they worked, the alien technicians gave answers that sounded more like poetry than science. The final assessment classified humanity as a Class C species, placing them in the same category as dozens of other young civilizations that the Council had encountered over the millennia. This designation meant that humans were considered to have potential for eventual advancement, but were currently too primitive and unstable to be trusted with advanced technology or significant responsibility within the galactic community. Zeth Kara delivered the Council's decision with what might have been sympathy, though it was difficult to tell with a being made of living crystal. Humanity would be offered restricted membership in the galactic community, allowing them to trade basic raw materials from their solar system in exchange for limited medical technology and basic scientific knowledge. The Council would establish a small monitoring station in Earth's asteroid belt to oversee human development and ensure compliance with galactic law. Most of the Council representatives considered the meeting a routine success, another primitive species safely catalogued and contained within appropriate boundaries. They noted humanity's unusual levels of aggression and adaptability in their reports, but these traits were dismissed as typical survival mechanisms that would naturally diminish as the species matured under proper guidance. Only the Luminar seemed troubled by something it had observed during the evaluation, filing a supplementary report that noted unusual patterns in human neural activity that defied conventional analysis. The energy being's concerns were noted and archived, but most Council members paid little attention to what seemed like academic curiosity about an unremarkable new species. Jake Morrison watched the alien ships disappear into the darkness beyond Pluto and wondered if humanity had just made the biggest mistake in its history by accepting what amounted to junior membership in a club they didn't understand. The medical technology the aliens had provided would save millions of lives, but something about their casual dismissal of human potential felt deeply wrong to him. 3 years had passed since the Galactic Council had filed humanity away as another predictable Class C species, and their monitoring station in the asteroid belt had been sending routine reports confirming their initial assessment. The humans were developing along expected lines, slowly adapting the medical technology they had been given and making modest improvements to their space travel capabilities. Everything appeared to be proceeding exactly as the Council's development models predicted. Commander Ryan Hayes stood on the bridge of the ship Liberty, Earth's first interstellar vessel, and marveled at how quickly human engineers had managed to build something that could actually travel between star systems. The ship wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't fast by alien standards, but it was entirely human-built using principles reverse-engineered from the limited technology samples the Council had provided. The fact that humans had managed to create a working faster-than-light drive at all should have been impossible, according to every development timeline the Council had on file. Dr. Lisa Parker had spent the last 3 years studying alien medical technology in ways that apparently surprised her Council liaisons. Instead of simply copying what the aliens had given them, human researchers had begun asking questions about why the technology worked the way it did. They had started experimenting with modifications and improvements that made the alien observers uncomfortable, though they couldn't quite explain why. The humans seemed to approach problems from directions that other species never considered. The Liberty's first diplomatic mission was supposed to be a simple goodwill tour, visiting 3 Council worlds to demonstrate humanity's gratitude for their inclusion in galactic civilization. Ryan Hayes had orders to be respectful, humble, and careful not to cause any diplomatic incidents that might jeopardize Earth's fragile relationship with the alien alliance. What nobody expected was that the humans would end up solving problems that had been puzzling these advanced civilizations for decades. On the water world of Aquanus, the aquatic Murthak had been struggling with structural failures in their underwater cities for over a century. The elegant spired buildings that housed millions of their people kept developing stress fractures that their best engineers couldn't prevent or predict. The council had sent teams of experts from 6 different species to study the problem, all of whom had concluded that it was an unfortunate consequence of the planet's unique geological conditions that would require expensive and ongoing maintenance. Ryan, Hayes and his small team of human engineers were given a polite tour of the damaged structures as a courtesy, with their Murthak hosts explaining the complex mathematical models that described why the buildings inevitably failed. The humans listened carefully and asked questions that seemed oddly basic to the alien engineers. Why were the buildings built to resist the water pressure instead of working with it? Why did they assume the geological forces were something to fight instead of something to redirect? Human engineer Tony Walker spent 2 days swimming through the damaged city sections with waterproof instruments, taking measurements that had nothing to do with the sophisticated stress analysis the Murthak had been conducting. He was looking at water flow patterns and how the buildings disrupted the natural currents that had been moving through these underwater valleys for millions of years. When he presented his findings, the solution seemed so obvious that the Murthak engineers were embarrassed they had never considered it. The problem wasn't structural engineering at all. The buildings were failing because they interrupted ancient current patterns that the planet's geology had been shaped around. By redesigning the city layout to channel water flow instead of blocking it, the stress on individual buildings dropped to almost nothing. The Murthak had been trying to build against their environment instead of building with it, and no amount of advanced materials or mathematical modeling could overcome that fundamental misunderstanding. Council observer Quindar of the Telepathic Mindari filed the first of what would become a series of increasingly concerned reports about human problem-solving methods. The Mindari could read the thoughts of most species clearly, but human minds seemed to work in ways that defied their understanding. Where other species thought in linear progressions from problem to solution, humans appeared to approach challenges from multiple directions simultaneously, often finding answers that more advanced civilizations had never considered. The second stop on the Liberty's diplomatic tour was the desert planet Xerion, home to the reptilian Sauroch, who had been struggling with food production for their growing population. The planet's harsh climate limited agriculture to small oasis regions that could no longer support the cities that had grown around them. The Council had provided advanced hydroponic systems and synthetic nutrients, but these solutions were expensive and required constant imports of materials that strained the planet's economy. Admiral Kate Sullivan had joined the diplomatic mission, specifically to observe human interactions with alien civilizations, and she found herself fascinated by how her people approached problems that seemed insurmountable to species with thousands of years more experience. The Sauroch had shown them vast stretches of desert that were considered completely unusable, explaining that the soil was too alkaline and the water table too deep for any known agricultural techniques. Human agricultural specialist Helen Davis asked for permission to take soil samples from areas the Sauroch considered worthless, spending days in the blazing desert heat with instruments that measured things the reptilian farmers had never thought to test. She wasn't looking for ways to change the environment to suit Earth crops, but rather trying to understand what kind of plants might actually thrive in conditions that other species considered hostile. The breakthrough came when Helen discovered that the alkaline soil that made conventional agriculture impossible was actually perfect for growing certain earth plants that had evolved in similar environments. By introducing crops that were adapted to high pH soil and low water conditions, the Sauroch could turn their vast deserts into productive farmland without expensive terraforming or constant imports of alien technology. More importantly, Helen's techniques could be adapted to use native Xerion plants that the Sauroch had never considered as food sources. These plants had evolved over millions of years to thrive in the planet's harsh conditions, but nobody had ever thought to systematically test their nutritional value or develop cultivation methods for them. Within months, the Sauroch were producing more food than they had ever grown before, using plants that were perfectly adapted to their world's environment. The third world on their diplomatic tour was supposed to be a simple ceremonial visit to the gas giant mining stations of the silicon-based Crystech, but even this routine stop produced unexpected results. The Crystech had been struggling with efficiency problems in their atmospheric processing facilities, losing significant amounts of valuable gases to leakage and contamination. Their crystalline bodies were perfectly adapted to the high-pressure environment, but their technology had reached a plateau that no amount of refinement seemed able to overcome. Human physicist Dr. Amy Clark spent her time at the mining stations asking questions about why the Crystech approached atmospheric processing the way they did. Their methods were elegant and sophisticated, using quantum manipulation techniques that were far beyond human understanding. But they were also incredibly complex, requiring constant maintenance and adjustment to deal with the chaotic nature of gas giant atmospheres. Amy's solution was embarrassingly simple. Instead of trying to control the atmospheric chaos, why not design systems that could benefit from it? Earth had experience with chaotic systems from studying weather patterns and ocean currents. By treating the gas giant's atmosphere like a weather system, instead of a static resource to be harvested, the Crystech could design processing facilities that used atmospheric turbulence to improve efficiency instead of fighting against it. The modifications Amy suggested were so basic that the Crystech engineers initially thought they were jokes. But when they tested her ideas, their processing efficiency increased by 40% almost immediately. The atmospheric chaos they had been struggling to control for centuries became a source of additional energy for their operations. Quindars. Reports to the Galactic Council were becoming increasingly urgent. The humans weren't just solving individual problems. They were demonstrating systematic approaches to challenges that no other species had developed. Their solutions weren't based on advanced technology or superior knowledge, but on ways of thinking that seemed to bypass the assumptions that limited other civilizations. The Council's Department of Species Development classified these achievements as statistical anomalies, noting that young species sometimes produced unexpected innovations before settling into more predictable development patterns. Their models indicated that human progress would plateau within a few years, as they encountered problems that required genuine technological advancement, rather than clever applications of basic principles. Back on Earth, the success of the Liberty's diplomatic mission was inspiring a new generation of scientists and engineers who were beginning to question why humanity should be satisfied with. 5 years after first contact, the Galactic Council's monitoring station in Earth's asteroid belt was sending reports that made senior council members question whether their surveillance equipment was malfunctioning. The humans were achieving technological milestones that typically took civilizations centuries to reach, and they were doing it in ways that violated every known pattern of species development. What made the situation even more disturbing was that human innovations weren't just copying alien technology, they were improving upon it in directions that even the Council's most advanced scientists hadn't considered. Dr. Alex Turner stood in the heart of the Mars Science Collective's primary research facility, surrounded by equipment that represented the most ambitious project humanity had ever attempted. His team had been studying the exotic matter that powered Council faster-than-light drives for 3 years, not just trying to understand how it worked, but questioning whether there might be better ways to achieve the same results. The breakthrough had come 6 months ago when they realized that the aliens were approaching dimensional manipulation from a fundamentally limited perspective. The Council's FTL technology worked by folding space-time around a vessel, creating a bubble of compressed space that allowed faster-than-light travel without violating the laws of physics. It was an elegant solution that had served galactic civilization for millennia, refined and perfected by dozens of species, until it reached what everyone assumed was its theoretical maximum efficiency. What Alex's team discovered was that the aliens had been thinking about the problem backwards. Instead of folding space around a ship, human scientists had found ways to convince space that the ship was already where it wanted to be. The philosophical difference seemed minor, but the or practical results were revolutionary. Human FTL drives required 90% less exotic matter than alien equivalents, traveled twice as fast, and produced none of the dimensional stress that limited how often Council ships could make jumps. Captain Maya Rodriguez commanded the First human-designed faster-than-light vessel, a ship called the Explorer that represented everything the Galactic Council found troubling about human development. The vessel combined alien technology with human innovations in ways that shouldn't have been possible, according to established engineering principles. Council observers who examined the ship's specifications couldn't understand how it functioned, much less how humans had designed it without access to the advanced mathematical frameworks that had taken other species millennia to develop. The Explorer's maiden voyage was supposed to be a simple test flight to Proxima Centauri and back, a journey that would take a Council ship several days to complete safely. Maya's crew made the round trip in 6 hours, including time spent conducting detailed surveys of 3 star systems that weren't even on their original flight plan. When Council representatives requested technical specifications for the human FTL drive, they received documentation that read more like philosophy textbooks than engineering manuals. The Vorthak Scientist Collective had been studying human technological development with increasing alarm for the past 2 years. Their crystalline minds were perfectly suited for complex mathematical analysis, and they had been the primary developers of most Council technologies for thousands of years. What disturbed them about human innovations wasn't just their effectiveness, but their complete disregard for the theoretical limitations that constrained other species. Zethkara personally reviewed every report from the human research facilities, trying to understand how a species that had barely discovered fire in galactic terms could be producing technologies that surpassed Council achievements. The humans seemed to approach engineering problems as if the laws of physics were suggestions rather than absolute constraints. Their solutions worked perfectly, but the mathematical frameworks that supported them were unlike anything in the Council's vast scientific archives. The energy-based Luminar were perhaps the most troubled by human advancement, because their dimensional nature gave them insights into reality that most other species couldn't comprehend. When they observed human scientists like Dr. Sam Collins working on theoretical physics problems, they saw thought patterns that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Human consciousness appeared to operate on levels that even the Luminar found difficult to follow or understand. Dr. Sam Collins had been working on what he called quantum consciousness theory, trying to understand why human problem-solving abilities seemed to exceed what should have been possible for a species with their level of technological development. His research suggested that human brains might be naturally connected to dimensional frameworks that other species could only access through advanced technology. If his theories were correct, then humanity's rapid advancement wasn't an anomaly, but a natural expression of capabilities that had been dormant until first contact triggered their activation. On the Council world of Nexus Prime, human diplomat Patricia Walsh was negotiating agreements that would have been impossible just months earlier. She wasn't asking for technology transfers or requesting permission to access restricted databases. Instead, she was proposing collaborative research projects where humans and aliens would work together as equals, sharing insights and innovations that neither species could achieve alone. The Council's negotiation specialists found Patricia's proposals almost impossible to categorize within their existing diplomatic frameworks. She wasn't operating from a position of weakness like other young species, nor was she making demands like established powers. Instead, she was suggesting partnership arrangements that assumed human capabilities were already comparable to those of species with thousands of years more experience. What made the negotiations even more unusual was that Patricia's assumptions were proving correct. Human research teams were producing results that justified their requests for equal status in areas where the Council had expected them to remain junior partners for centuries. When she requested access to the Council's quantum mechanics databases, human physicists were already working on problems that the database couldn't address. The first equal status trade agreement in Council history for a species less than a decade old was signed despite strong opposition from conservative factions, who argued that humanity was advancing too quickly to be trusted with advanced responsibilities. The agreement granted humans access to technologies that most species required centuries of proven stability to earn, but the Council's own scientists were beginning to admit that human research capabilities might actually exceed their own in certain areas. Council Supreme Commander Veltharion of the warrior Drakmari had been watching human military development with professional interest that was gradually becoming genuine concern. Human tactical approaches were unlike anything in the Council's strategic databases, combining elements from different schools of military thought in ways that created entirely new paradigms of conflict resolution. More disturbing was that human, military innovations were proving effective against simulation scenarios that had previously been considered unsolvable. The humans weren't developing more powerful weapons or stronger defenses, both of which the Council could have understood and countered. Instead, they were redefining what military conflict meant by treating warfare as a complex system that could be optimized rather than simply won or lost. Human tactical simulations consistently achieved objectives that Council strategists considered impossible, not through superior firepower but through approaches that made conventional military thinking obsolete. Dr. Amy Clark's research into gravitational manipulation had produced technologies that the Council's physicists insisted should be impossible, but which worked perfectly in practical applications. Her techniques for generating localized gravitational fields required no exotic matter and consumed less energy than conventional propulsion systems, yet produced effects that surpassed anything in the Council's archives. The breakthrough had come when Amy stopped thinking about gravity as a force to be overcome and started treating it as information that could be edited. By convincing local spacetime that gravitational relationships were different than they actually were, human ships could accelerate without producing the massive energy signatures that made Council vessels detectable across entire star systems. Engineer Jake Morris had been working on what he called probability engineering, developing technologies that could influence the likelihood of specific outcomes without violating causality or conservation laws. His devices couldn't predict the future or change the past, but they could make beneficial coincidences more likely and reduce the probability of equipment failures or navigation errors. The Council's scientists declared probability engineering to be either impossible or dangerous, possibly both. The mathematical frameworks that supported Jake's research were based on interpretations of quantum mechanics that most species had abandoned as too unstable for practical application. Yet human probability devices worked consistently and safely, producing results that shouldn't have been achievable through any known scientific principles. The Mindari telepath Quindar had been filing increasingly desperate reports about human mental capabilities that seemed to exceed the limits. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in panic as reports flooded in from the Outer Rim territories. Ancient machines that had slumbered in the void beyond the galaxy for 10,000 years had suddenly awakened, and their first action was to begin systematically consuming everything in their path. The Devourers, as they came to be known, were unlike any threat the Council had faced in recorded history. They were not a species seeking resources or territory, but a machine intelligence driven by programming that treated all organic life as inefficient waste to be recycled into more useful forms. Council Supreme Commander Veltharion stood before the emergency assembly and delivered the most sobering military briefing in galactic history. The Devourer swarms had destroyed 17 star systems in the past month, consuming planets, stars, and entire civilizations with mechanical efficiency that made resistance seem pointless. Combined Council fleets had engaged the machines in 3 separate battles and had been defeated so completely that only scattered survivors remained to report what they had witnessed. The Devourers fought with technology that surpassed even the Council's most advanced capabilities, employing weapons that could disintegrate matter at the quantum level and shields that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Worse still, they appeared to learn from each engagement, adapting their tactics and technologies to counter whatever strategies the Council deployed against them. Every victory against individual Devourer units only made the collective swarm more dangerous. Dr. Lisa Parker received the emergency transmission from Earth's Council liaison while she was conducting routine research on alien medical technology. The message was brief and terrifying. The galaxy was under attack by machines that had already destroyed more worlds than humanity had ever known existed, and the Council's combined military might was proving inadequate to stop them. All member species were being asked to contribute whatever resources they could spare to the desperate defense effort. Jake Morrison found himself appointed as Earth's military representative to the Council war effort, despite protests that humanity had been part of galactic civilization for less than a decade. and had no experience with threats of this magnitude. The appointment wasn't based on any belief in human military capabilities, but rather on the simple fact that the Council was so desperate for resources that they were willing to accept help from anyone, even a species they still considered primitively violent. General Nina Barnes arrived at Council military headquarters on Nexus Prime, expecting to serve as a minor support officer in what was clearly a doomed defensive campaign. Instead, she found herself in meetings with the galaxy's most experienced military commanders, all of whom seemed paralyzed by an enemy that operated outside every tactical framework they understood. The Devourers didn't follow conventional military logic, and traditional strategies that had worked against organic opponents were useless against machines that treated warfare as an optimization problem. The Council's approach to fighting the Devourers was based on trying to match their technological superiority with increasingly powerful weapons and stronger defensive systems. Every engagement followed the same pattern. Council forces would deploy their most advanced ships and weapons, achieve some initial success against individual Devourer units, and then watch helplessly as the machines adapted and overwhelmed them with upgraded countermeasures. Nina Barnes spent 3 days reviewing tactical reports from the failed engagements before she realized that the Council was approaching the problem from entirely the wrong direction. They were treating the Devourers as a military enemy to be defeated through superior force, but the machines weren't following military logic at all. They were following programming, which meant they could be approached as a technical problem rather than a strategic one. Dr. Alex Turner's research team on Mars had been monitoring the Council's scientific analysis of Devourer technology, and what they discovered was more encouraging than anyone had dared hope. The machines were incredibly advanced, but their design principles were based on concepts that human computer scientists understood perfectly. The Devourers were essentially a massive distributed artificial intelligence, and while their individual capabilities far exceeded human technology, their fundamental architecture followed patterns that human programmers had been working with for decades. Colonel Ben Foster was leading the tactical analysis of Devourer behavior patterns when he made the connection that changed everything. The machines weren't adapting to Council strategies randomly. They were following logical decision trees that could be predicted and manipulated. If the Devourers were treating warfare as an optimization problem, then the solution wasn't to fight them with superior force, but to give them a problem that would cause their optimization algorithms to fail. The plan that emerged from human analysis was so audacious that most Council members initially dismissed it as impossible. Instead of trying to destroy the Devourer swarms, the humans proposed infiltrating the machine network and convincing it to shut itself down. The concept relied on introducing logical paradoxes into the Devourer programming that would cause the artificial intelligence to become trapped in recursive loops until it essentially debugged itself into dormancy. Captain Chris Hudson volunteered to lead the strike team that would attempt to penetrate the Devourer mothership and implement the human virus. The mission was considered suicidal by every Council military analyst, but Chris had studied the tactical reports and believed that the machine's predictable responses to conventional attacks could be exploited by a team that operated outside normal military parameters. The strike force that assembled for the mission included the best warriors from 6 different Council species, but the humans made up the core technical team. Dr. Amy Clark and engineer Jake Morris had spent weeks developing a computer virus based on philosophical paradoxes that should theoretically cause any logical system to become trapped in infinite loops while attempting to resolve contradictory imperatives. The Devourer mothership was a structure so massive that it dwarfed entire planets, a mechanical construct that served as the central processing node for the collective intelligence that controlled millions of individual machine units across dozens of star systems. Council reconnaissance had determined that the mothership's defenses were impenetrable, protected by weapon systems that could destroy entire fleets and shields that operated on physical principles that no organic technology could breach. The human plan ignored the mothership's defenses entirely, instead focusing on exploiting the logical frameworks that controlled Devourer decision-making processes. Instead of fighting their way through the mechanical defenders, the strike team would convince the machines that they belonged there by presenting credentials that satisfied the artificial intelligence's security protocols while simultaneously violating them in ways that the logic systems couldn't resolve. The infiltration phase of the mission succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, as the human-designed deception protocols confused the Devourer security systems long enough for the strike team to reach the mothership's central processing core. The chamber they found was a cathedral of crystalline processors and quantum computing arrays that stretched beyond the limits of vision, a technological marvel that represented the accumulated knowledge of whatever civilization had originally created the machines. Dr. Amy Clark connected her portable computer to the central processing core, while Jake Morris stood guard against mechanical defenders that seemed strangely reluctant to attack intruders who had somehow gained access to their most secure facility. The virus upload took only minutes, but those minutes felt like hours as the strike team waited to see whether human logic could overcome machine intelligence that had been refined over millennia. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Throughout the mothership, mechanical systems began shutting down as the artificial intelligence became trapped in logical loops that prevented it from executing any commands while it attempted to resolve the paradoxes the humans had introduced. The Devourer collective intelligence found itself unable to process the concept of statements that were simultaneously true and false, causing cascading failures throughout the entire network. The shutdown spread from the mothership to every Devourer unit across the galaxy as the collective intelligence struggled with philosophical problems that had puzzled human philosophers for centuries, but which the machines had no frameworks for handling. Within hours, the greatest threat in galactic history had been neutralized not through superior firepower, but through the application of logical paradoxes that convinced the artificial intelligence to voluntarily enter dormancy while it attempted to resolve unsolvable problems. The victory sent shockwaves through the Galactic Council that were more profound than the original Devourer threat had been. A machine intelligence that had effortlessly defeated the combined military might of dozens of advanced civilizations had been stopped by a small team of humans using techniques that no other species had even considered. The implications were staggering and forced every council member to reconsider everything they thought they knew about warfare. The Galactic Council chambers had never hosted a session quite like this one. Representatives from every member species filled the vast amphitheater, but for the first time in the Council's millennia-long history, they were gathering not to debate policy or resolve disputes, but to formally acknowledge that their fundamental understanding of intelligence and civilization had been proven inadequate. The humans had not merely exceeded expectations, they had redefined what was possible in ways that forced the entire galaxy to reconsider the nature of consciousness and technological development. Ambassador Carol Stone stood at the central podium, where countless alien dignitaries had delivered speeches over the centuries, but her address would be unlike any that had come before. She wasn't speaking as a representative of a junior species seeking approval or assistance, nor as an equal partner negotiating mutual benefits. Instead, she was presenting concepts that challenged the basic assumptions upon which galactic civilization had been built for thousands of years. The proposal Carol presented was revolutionary in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of the hierarchical development model that had governed council policy since its founding, she suggested a cooperative framework based on the principle that every species possessed unique cognitive capabilities that could contribute to collective advancement. The idea that primitive civilizations might have valuable insights to offer advanced ones had never been seriously considered by any council member. Dr. Tony Walker had spent months preparing the scientific evidence that supported Carol's proposals, analyzing patterns in human problem-solving that seemed to operate outside conventional frameworks of logic and analysis. His research suggested that human consciousness might represent an entirely new category of intelligence that bridged multiple dimensional states simultaneously, allowing humans to access solutions that existed outside the normal parameters of cause and effect. The Council's ancient archives were opened to human scholars for the first time in galactic history, revealing records that stretched back millions of years and documented the rise and fall of countless civilizations. What Professor Helen Davis discovered in those archives was both fascinating and disturbing. Humanity exhibited characteristics that matched two extinct species that the Council had classified as impossible to integrate and had mysteriously vanished from all records several million years ago. The extinct species had possessed what the archives described as transcendent cognitive capabilities that allowed them to solve problems by accessing information that didn't exist within normal space-time boundaries. The Council's xenopsychologists had concluded that such abilities were too dangerous for galactic stability and had classified both species as evolutionary dead ends that had somehow transcended physical existence rather than adapting to it. Professor Helen's analysis of the ancient records suggested a very different interpretation. The extinct species hadn't disappeared because their abilities were dangerous, but because they had evolved beyond the need for physical existence and had chosen to explore realities that the Council couldn't perceive or understand. The possibility that humanity might be following a similar evolutionary path was both exciting and terrifying to species that had spent millennia believing that technological advancement was the only measure of progress. Dr. Lisa Parker's research into quantum consciousness theory had progressed far beyond anything the Council's scientists had attempted, producing technologies that seemed to violate causality while somehow remaining perfectly stable and predictable. Her devices could influence probability without violating conservation laws, access information from parallel dimensional states, and manipulate time in ways that didn't create paradoxes, but rather resolved them. The implications of Lisa's research were staggering. If human consciousness could naturally access multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously, then the limitations that constrained other species might be artificial boundaries rather than natural laws. The possibility that reality itself might be more flexible than anyone had imagined was forcing Council scientists to question every assumption they had made about the nature of existence. Engineer Jake Morris had been working on what he called reality engineering, developing technologies that could edit the fundamental parameters of local space-time without causing the catastrophic instabilities that should have resulted from such manipulations. His devices didn't break the laws of physics so much as convince physics that different laws were more appropriate for specific situations. The Council's physicists declared Jake's work to be either impossible or extremely dangerous. Possibly both. The mathematical frameworks that supported reality engineering were based on interpretations of quantum mechanics that treated consciousness as a fundamental force rather than an emergent property of complex systems. Yet human reality devices worked consistently and safely, producing effects that no other species had ever achieved. The Mindari telepath Quinn Dar had been conducting extensive studies of human mental capabilities and had reached conclusions that disturbed every member of the Council's Consciousness Research Division. Human minds appeared to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, accessing information and processing capabilities that existed outside normal biological constraints. When humans worked together on complex problems, their individual consciousness seemed to merge into collective intelligence networks that exceeded the sum of their individual capabilities. Captain Maya Rodriguez had been exploring regions of space that the Council had declared too dangerous or impossible to reach, using human FTL technologies that operated on principles that made conventional navigation irrelevant. Her ship could travel through dimensions that other species couldn't perceive, accessing shortcuts through space-time that reduced journey times from years to minutes, while somehow avoiding the temporal paradoxes that should have resulted from such manipulations. The discoveries Maya's expeditions were making challenged everything the Council thought they knew about the structure of the galaxy. Entire civilizations existed in parallel dimensional states that could only be accessed through consciousness-based navigation techniques that no other species had developed. These hidden civilizations possessed technologies and knowledge that made even the Council's most advanced achievements seem primitive by comparison. Ambassador Rachel Turner found herself appointed as humanity's representative to the Council's newly formed Department of Transcendent Species Development, a classification that had been created specifically to deal with civilizations that operated outside normal evolutionary parameters. The department's mandate was to establish protocols for contact with intelligences that might exist beyond physical reality, a task that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The Council's formal recognition of humanity as the first guide species in galactic history was more than an acknowledgement of their unique capabilities. It was an admission that the Council's entire understanding of intelligence and civilization had been fundamentally flawed. The hierarchical development model that had governed galactic policy for millennia was being replaced by a cooperative framework that treated diversity of thought as more valuable than technological advancement. Dr. Sam Collins had been working with Council philosophers and consciousness researchers to develop new theories about the nature of intelligence that could account for human capabilities without invalidating the achievements of other species. His research suggested that consciousness might be a universal force that could manifest in countless different forms, each offering unique perspectives on reality that contributed to a greater understanding of existence itself. The most profound change in galactic civilization wasn't technological but philosophical. The Council was being forced to abandon the assumption that there was a single correct path of development that all species should follow. Instead, they were beginning to understand that every form of consciousness represented a unique way of experiencing and understanding reality, each offering insights that no other perspective could provide. The final session of the Emergency Council Assembly concluded with an unprecedented decision. Humanity would be granted full membership with special status as evolutionary guides, tasked with helping other species discover their own unique capabilities rather than following predetermined development paths. The Council was essentially admitting that they had been limiting their own potential by trying to force all species into the same evolutionary framework. Jake Morrison found himself appointed as the first human member of the Council's High Command, responsible for developing new exploration protocols that could safely contact intelligences that existed beyond normal space-time boundaries. The position had been created specifically for humans because no other species had demonstrated the cognitive flexibility necessary to communicate with transcendent consciousness. The story concluded with humanity taking its place not as another member of galactic civilization, but as the catalyst that would transform what galactic civilization meant. The Council's recognition that diversity of thought was more valuable than uniformity of development opened possibilities that no one had previously imagined.